Okay. So welcome, everyone. I am Julie Zuckerman, author of the Book of Jeremiah, and welcome to the June Literary Modiin author event. I'll give a few words of introduction, and sorry to those who've heard my spiel like 1,000 times, but Modiin is a planned city in Israel, about halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, close to the airport, so come visit. And we have a large population of English speakers here in Modiin. So in June 2019, so 4 years ago, we started Literary Modiin as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to the large community of readers we have here. And after a few in-person events, when the pandemic hit, we switched to virtual, which allows us to welcome authors and welcome attendees from all over. Today's event is our 37th, so yay. Okay, the format of the event is that each author will be speaking for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. You're all on mute, so you should put your questions in the chat box. And any technical difficulties, just send me a private note in the chat. We're broadcasting this live in the Literary Modiin Facebook group. And I'm recording it, and tomorrow I'll send around the recording and all the links in case you miss some. I'll just say, I'll show it at the end, but there's a few events that are already scheduled coming up on June 25th, 2 weeks from today. It's not Literary Modiin, but I'm doing another similar event with two authors of new short story collections, Jolene Ilwain and Sheena McAuliffe. Their new collections, Sidle Creek and We Are a Teeming Wilderness. And then the July and August Literary Modiin events are already scheduled. July 23rd with Daisy Alpert Florin, who wrote My Last Innocent Year, Haviva Ner David, To Die in Secret, and Maxim Schreier's memoir, Immigrant Baggage. And August, we're going to have Yoni Hammer Kasoy, the Book of Noah, Daphne Calote, The Archivist, and Michael Golding, Quick Bright Things. So I'll send the links for you all to sign up tomorrow. And now I will introduce our first speaker. Meryl Ain is a writer, author, podcaster, and career educator. Her new novel, Shadows We Carry, is the sequel to The Takeaway Men, her award-winning debut novel, which was published in 2020. Her articles and essays have appeared in numerous publications, and she's the author of 2 nonfiction books. A member of the International Advisory Board for Holocaust Survivor Day, she's the host of the podcast People of the Book and the founder of the Facebook group Jews Love to Read. If you're on Facebook and you're not in that group, you should definitely join it. It's a great group. She holds a BA from Queens College and an MA from Columbia and a doctorate in education from Hofstra University. She and her husband, Stuart, a journalist, live in New York. They have 3 married sons and 6 grandchildren. So I'm going to now spotlight you, Meryl, and you can take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Julie. I'm delighted to be here with Seth and Kim, and I appreciate this wonderful opportunity to meet virtually with authors and readers in Israel and throughout the world. So my book, Shadows We Carry, was published on April 25th, and it begins in the late 1960s and tells the story of the Lubinsky twins, Jojo and Branka, who are students at Queens College in New York. And if there's one thing Jojo wants, she wants to be a famous actress. And Branka is the serious twin, and she wants to be a journalist, but she also wants a home and family. Now, complicating these dreams is their very naughty family background. Their mother was a righteous Gentile who saved their father during the World War II, and he still suffers from the trauma of the Holocaust, where his first family was murdered after the war by Nazi sympathizers. So both sisters are constrained by the times in which they live. Jojo has an unplanned pregnancy in the years before Roe v. Wade became the law of the land in the United States. And Branka wants to be a journalist, and she wants to go to graduate school for journalism. And she finds out that there are obstacles to women both getting into school and to succeeding in what was then a very male-dominated profession, which is interesting now because there are so many women who are successful in the field. Her friend and colleague Brian discovers that his father was a guard at Auschwitz, and Brian's former teacher, a Catholic priest, also struggles with his identity after he learns that he was adopted. So for those who haven't read my first novel, the new book can be read as a standalone, but it's also a sequel to my first post-Holocaust novel, The Takeaway Men. And at the front of the book, I provide a list and a brief description of the main characters. And so I decided that this would be a good device, both to refresh the memory of those who've read the first book and to those who are just reading Shadows We Carry as a standalone. I wrote the book in 9 months while my husband and I were sequestered at home during the COVID-19 pandemic. It took me much longer to write The Takeaway Men. He was waiting to find a kidney donor after he had been told by his nephrologist that he would have to go on dialysis if he didn't get one soon. So disciplining myself to write every day took me into another realm, away from health and safety concerns. And fortuitously, about the same time that I completed the first draft of Shadows We Carry, and an altruistic anonymous donor came to the rescue. The writing process was seamless for me since I knew the characters well from The Takeaway Men. So my first book ends when they're in high school, and I was just so honored and touched that so many readers asked me to write a sequel. They wanted to know what happened to the sisters going forward, and I was tremendously gratified. And the truth is, I had a lot more that I wanted to say on this subject. So I set out to continue the story of the twins as they finished college and became adults in the late 60s and 70s. And most of all, I wanted to recreate what it was like for young women back then. And my book is resonating with baby boomers who lived through it, and also the next generation who are in some cases very surprised at the unbelievable obstacles, even in law, that women were subjected to. So I wanted to tell the story of what it was like for women to come of age in the United States when women were just beginning to fight for their rights, and where institutionalized discrimination still existed and abortion was illegal. So interestingly, when I wrote the first draft of Shadows We Carry, Jojo was in college and found herself with an unwanted pregnancy. This was 4 years before Roe v. Wade became the law of the land, which is the Supreme Court decision that made abortion legal. And her friends discussed with her the limited and sometimes very dangerous options that were available to her at the time. And when the Supreme Court, shockingly, at least I was shocked, overturned this landmark decision in June 2022, I had to revise my author's notes at the end of the book because I had written that abortion was now legal and I had to change that. So in the meantime, while her sister is dealing with this unwanted pregnancy and all the ramifications and the family issues and what should she do about it, Branka was very intent on pursuing a career in journalism. And what she wanted to do was get a master's in journalism. So I'm going to read you a short excerpt just where the dean interviews her about this. And I might add that all my, of course, this is fictional and the characters are fictional, but it's all based on facts. So this, I do meticulous research. I'm a former history teacher, and this is accurate. This happened to people during that time. Well, you certainly are a prolific writer, said the dean, but do you think you have what it takes to be a journalist? Do you think you're assertive enough, actually aggressive enough to do what it takes to chase down a story? Yes, I do, Branka answered, mustering every bit of confidence she had. I've done it numerous times on my assignments for the school newspaper, and I'm also very competitive. I want to be the first one with the breaking news. Well, you are a very impressive young woman, Miss Lubinsky, and your credentials are top-notch, stellar grades and a track record of performance in the field. And I did mention earlier that you're easy on the eyes. I do have to tell you, though, we only admit 100 graduate students a year. That's from the whole country, actually the entire world. You know, we have foreign students too. Out of the 100, we have a quota for women. It's about 20%. So we will only be admitting 20 women this year. So here's my last question. I ask every woman this question, and I must ask it of you too. Do you plan on getting married and having a family? You see, because our enrollment is so limited, we want the women we admit to stay in the field. It's been our experience that women don't have the same staying power as men in the profession once they have a family. It's a fact, but things are changing, Branka retorted. Maybe so, dear, but change is always slow. And right now, that's what the statistics tell us. We make a serious investment in all of our students, and we want to see the results. So please answer the question. Do you plan on getting married and having a family? Branka's face turned red and she scowled. This is patently unfair, she thought to herself. I certainly have no immediate plans to get married or have a child. So you don't have a boyfriend? No steady fellow? Surprising for a girl as pretty as you. No, I don't. And what I want more than anything is to come to the journalism school and learn from the best. I want to make my mark as a journalist and bring honor to this institution. Good answer, said the dean as he winked at her. Afterwards, she thought she should have smiled more during the interview, but that wasn't the real reason for the sinking feeling she had. She knew that there was a different standard for men and women. So besides gender equity, Shadows We Carry also addresses the issues of gender identity, historical upheaval, and family relationships. And I wanted to raise various themes for readers to think about, including nature versus nurture, prejudice and anti-Semitism, and individual responsibility. So as I mentioned before, the twins and their peers, including a Catholic priest and the son of a former Nazi, struggle with their family's ancestry and how much influence it has on their lives. The priest was born to a Jewish couple during the Holocaust. When he's a month old, they give him to a Catholic couple for safekeeping, and they perish in the Holocaust. And the Jewish boy is raised as a Catholic, later brought to the United States, where he becomes a priest. On his adopted mother's deathbed, she confesses to him that his biological parents were Jewish. And then we have the son of the former Nazi, who finds out in his 20s that his father was an SS guard who stood with a whip ushering Jews into the gas chamber. And the twins' mother, although she has been practicing Judaism and raising her children as Jews, and people think she's a very good Jew, actually never officially converted. So technically, she's not Jewish. So in Shadows We Carry, I wanted to raise the issues of Jewish identity. Who is a Jew? And I know this is a big question in Israel. It's a question in the United States. It continues to be a perplexing question for Jews. And then the larger issue of bloodlines. Are we defined by our genes or our environment? How do buried secrets affect families from generation to generation? Do the shadows we all carry determine who we are? And who is responsible for the misdeeds of previous generations? So I left all those questions open-ended. That's totally for the reader to decide, but I think these are important and interesting questions, and it's fascinating to talk about them. So one of the devices that I used was to make my main characters twins. And one of the reasons I did this, and first I always say that I am not a child of Holocaust survivors. In fact, we do not have any known Holocaust survivors in our family, but this is a subject that has been very close to my heart ever since I read The Diary of Anne Frank in the 6th grade. And as I said, I was a history teacher. Seems like I have been researching this topic my entire life. So I relied heavily on meticulous research and the input of my many friends who are second generation. And what I learned from them was that while the impact or the shadow or the cloud of the Holocaust hovers over every family, each individual reacts differently to it. So I thought to do them justice, it was important to show. So the twins are on opposite poles in terms of their reactions. And I got the idea of twins because I'm married to an identical twin, although my twins in the book are fraternal. And I see, they have some of the same tastes and the same likes, and they went into the same profession, but they're totally different human beings. Their values and their characters are very different. Finally, anti-Semitism is an important theme in the book. So Shadows We Carry discusses attempts to track down and deport Nazis who lied their way into the US after World War II. In my first book, there's no recourse. The United States government was not interested in pursuing Nazis. And in fact, they invited them to come to this country to work in the space program and to track down communists. But it later the tide turned and there was an interest in it, and this is reflected in my book. And I write about a community on Long Island where they encourage not former Nazis, but people of German ancestry to live there. So unfortunately, we still have anti-Semitism, and I just want to thank Julie for this great group and wonderful opportunity. And if any of you are in a book club, I'd be happy to meet with the group virtually. And you can reach me through my website, merylain.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Meryl. That was great. Yeah, actually, you just reminded me of two other books or two other authors we've hosted. Their books are on similar topics. Once We Were Home by Jennifer Rosner. It's here in maybe our March event about children who were hidden during the Holocaust.
Yes, yeah, great
Um,
book. That's a great
and
book.
also, what's it called? Hold on. The one by In the Shadow of Dora by Patrick Hicks, non-Jewish author who wrote about a survivor and the Nazis who were brought over to work on the space program.
Oh,
Yeah,
I have to read that one.
yeah. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our next author. Seth Rogoff is the author of the novels First the Raven, a preface, Then Rising Vapors, and the Kirschbaum Lectures, which came out last month, as well as the nonfiction book The Politics of the Dreamscape. He is the co-author of The Education of Kendrick Perkins, and he lives in Prague, and he also teaches at a bunch of places. Maybe he'll tell us about. So let me spotlight you, Seth, and take it away.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks to Meryl and Kim. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be able to hear about your work and to talk a little bit about my work and do a little reading from the Kirschbaum Lectures, which, just as Julie said, came out in May. This is the book, has a nice cover. I'm not quite sure why the head is cut off there, but I kind of like that. It sort of goes with the themes in the book. Though I'm not quite sure the lecturer in the book would be so well dressed, but in any case, I appreciate the cover design. This is my third book with this same independent press, and I've really had a great experience working with them. And this time I was just saying, okay, whatever you want to do for the cover, I trust you. I don't want to be involved, because anytime I get involved, it seems to make the cover maybe worse. So I'm quite happy with how the book came out. But in any case, so I'll say a few words, not as eloquently as the last presentation, I think, maybe not as in depth, because the book is less, as I'll say, is less kind of narratively coherent and much more sort of fragmentary. But in any case, the novel, the Kirschbaum Lectures, it's narrated by the title character, Cy Kirschbaum, who has, at least as he presents it in the lectures, he's come basically directly from time at like a Czech mental health clinic, or we might call it kind of a cross between a sort of wellness clinic and a sort of psychoanalytic treatment. So he's come from some months at this clinic, and he's received an offer to teach one class in his hometown. He wants to come back to his hometown to spend some time with his father, whose sort of health is in decline. And so yes, he's returned to teach this class, and kind of leaving a life behind, at least temporarily, in a life in Europe that started in Berlin and then kind of moved to Prague, where he was working for many years as a translator of literature from German and then from Czech to English. Okay, so he's hired to teach this class. It's a sort of entry-level class, beginning first-year class called Introduction to Literature. It's a class that basically exists at every college in the country. Often it's a requirement for a humanities degree at many colleges. So the novel, as you might be able to sense from the title, it's structured around a weekly lecture to this particular class, to this group of students. So there are 12 lectures in the book. Each lecture is kind of presented as a sort of live lecture that is being delivered to the students over this 12-week semester. Rather than following any kind of typical or traditional curriculum, the students in this particular class who are being addressed by the lectures and then the readers, they find themselves encountering, rather than description of a sort of well-prepared and logical and kind of expected presentation about literature, as they would maybe think about it in an introduction to literature class. Rather, he sort of presents a collection of various types of texts, mostly drawn from his autobiographical or his work experience and his kind of commentary on these texts. These particular texts that he's kind of presenting to the class, they kind of start, they start off seemingly kind of discrete, but then over time, as the kind of lectures progress and we get deeper into the book, they start to connect, merge, one might even say shift or re-narrate earlier texts. And so the things become much more intertwined, interwoven, and intertextual as the lectures unfold. What these sources, I call these texts the sort of body of things that this Cy Kirschbaum is presenting, we call them sources. What holds them together, and thus what holds the novel together, if there is something that holds it together ultimately, is both the embodied presence of the lecturer. So Cy Kirschbaum delivering these lectures is a sort of through line. And then also his kind of search for an understanding, I would say, of the sort of vanished world, or what he perceives as a kind of vanished world of a sort of international bohemian counterculture of artists and writers in post-communist Berlin and Prague. So it really unfolds, these sort of sources unfold against that landscape of Berlin, Germany, Prague, Czech Republic, from the mid 90s into the 2000s. Cy kind of pushes into this past, which, his own past, through this body of source material that he's drawing on. And as he does this, as he sort of seeks to kind of unpack and understand that history and his participation in it, maybe one could say the reality is becoming kind of more tenuous, or understanding our clarity of what's real and what's sort of imagined, or what's part of the sort of fictional landscape versus the non-fictional landscape. As these things kind of start to break down, he also starts to run up against the kind of structures of authority and power that sort of seek to sort of circumscribe his project. Those are like the psychologists, the dean, and even one would say like the rules of narration. And so I guess sort of thematically exploring the sort of way in which stories, history, selfhood are kind of coalescing and disintegrating. The texts themselves that Cy is working with in the lectures are from a range of different, are a range of different types: poems, diaries, marginalia, letters, short stories, even a psychoanalytic case study on him is presented. And so, but they're not really meant as they would be in a traditional literature class, where one would kind of search for meaning through them. Rather, they're kind of catalysts for some kind of engagement or response. So this will be kind of an interesting, this is sort of interesting that Meryl and I are both starting with texts that have to do with the figure of a dean. I wasn't really expecting that when I chose my selection, but that's sort of the weird world we live in. So I'll just read a couple of pages from the 9th lecture in the book, because I think it works well for this format. So this is the end of the 9th lecture. Again, I must break off. We're at the end of the session, or well over time. I apologize for keeping you past the designated hour. There was no other way. For God's sake, I'm stuck in these marginalia and can barely carry out basic tasks like grooming, laundry, eating properly and at appointed times, sleeping, to say nothing of finding the elusive balance everybody keeps talking about. Everything rather is unbalanced, off kilter. Over the weekend, for example, I took a long, slow walk with my father. Ever since his decline in health, or perhaps more accurately, his decline in wellness, he hasn't said much. And I couldn't tell whether this was a way of keeping his thoughts to himself, or whether these thoughts had become jumbled to the point that he couldn't find a way of expressing them. Surely he had thoughts, even of the most mundane nature. Over the past months, in any case, I tried to shield him from anything he might find unpleasant, including, or especially, my deteriorating status at the college, in my increasingly tense relationship with the dean and the dean's assistant. After my bold escape from the lecture hall following last week's lecture, however, I received the following note from the dean, written on his behalf, of course, by his assistant. I know our time has run out, but please stay a few minutes longer. Here's the letter. Dear Cy Kirschbaum, some irregularities have come to our attention concerning your course, EN 102, Introduction to Literature, Section 3, and related matters. In the interest of clarity, we will enumerate the most relevant issues. Number 1, the course syllabus has been taken from the department's syllabus archive, specifically from Professor Rosinki's 1997 version, without alteration of anything but the name of the instructor. And this alteration consisted only of you crossing out Rosinki and penning in Kirschbaum next to it. 2, you have not made available, either on the college's reserve system or through the bookstore, any of the readings on the Rosinki syllabus. 3, despite teaching a literature class, you have not discussed a single piece of literature that has been assigned on the syllabus for the students to read. 4, our investigations have conclusively found that your students have not read a single page of any text for your course. 5, students claim they have not participated in any way in any session of your course. We remind you that we cap our course at 20 students to ensure participation. The school's policy of encouraging, quote, active learning was described to you during your initial meeting with the dean and in the teaching packet you received with your course registration list. 6, students in your course admit to regularly using your course to A, sleep, B, engage in social media, C, quote, zone out, D, doodle. 7, you have not collected a single essay or other assignment. Students admit to having done no written work in your course. 8, most students in your course describe your lectures as, quote, pointless. 9, 25% of your students describe your lectures as, quote, disturbed or, quote, disturbing. 10, we know you are using class time to disparage the dean. 11, you have failed to make yourself available for office hours for students to discuss their concerns directly with you. Our email of September 10, insisting that you hold regular weekly office hours, has not been answered. 12, by our count, you have received 76 emails from students in your class. You have not responded to one. And the technology office, TO, has informed us that you've not opened or read any of them. According to the TO, you have not logged into your college email account ever. 13, you are said to lose your composure in class, at times laughing hysterically, at others crying or pounding your fist on the lectern. Students have referred to these moments as, quote, unsettling, unquote, displays of emotion. 14, you failed to post midterm grades and have not responded to 10 separate requests that you do so immediately. Furthermore, you have no apparent plan to calculate and report final semester grades. 15, finally, for now, you have failed to show up to a single mandatory faculty or committee meeting in violation of the terms of your contract. There's no point addressing the dean's ridiculous letter. I have to believe those so-called, quote, investigations are nothing but an attempt to coerce me. Proof of this, not that I need any, is that I am standing here in front of you, standing in front of all of you, for not even one of you has missed a single lecture. My college ID still triggers the outer door. My paychecks continue to arrive. I continue successfully to cash them. Despite this counter evidence, during my walk with my father, I divulged to him that the dean was building a case against me, that his enforcer, the dean's assistant, had struck the initial blow. I guess I'd expected some sympathy or commiseration about my ill treatment at the hands of executive power, but what I got from my father was something else. It's a shame, he said to me, that you couldn't have turned this into something. You could have built on this, a building block for the future, an accomplishment. I'd hoped that at some point you would have discovered some entrepreneurial spirit, a will or desire to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. That was great. I wanted to say something. Oh, I appreciate that you're you have like a hybrid within a hybrid, right? Like the whole novel is in the form of lectures, and then you have the letter in there. A great list. So, great job. Okay, let me introduce our last author. Kim Salzman was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio. After receiving a law degree from the University of Michigan, Kim fulfilled a lifelong dream by immigrating to Israel, where she became fascinated by the stories of Jewish immigrants from all over the world. In Israel, Kim served in the International Law Department of the Israel Defense Forces. She also worked for the United Nations Refugee Agency and for an NGO advocating for the legal rights of Ethiopian Israelis. Before writing Straddling Black and White, Kim traveled to Ethiopia and was deeply moved and intrigued by the heroic immigration of Ethiopian Jewry to Israel. Today, Kim lives in northern Israel with her husband, 3 children, and a dog, and works as the Israel and Overseas Director at the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. So let me spotlight you, Kim. Take it away. Go ahead.
Okay, hi everyone. 1 second. Can you hear me? For some reason. Okay. First, I want to start off by saying thank you to Seth and Meryl. It was really interesting to learn about your books and to meet authors. As a first-time author, this is an exciting experience for me to be here. And I wanted to thank Julie for hosting today's event. This is an incredible opportunity for us to talk about our books, to share our books with people from all over the world, and I really appreciate it. Kol hakavod, and keep up the great work. So I'll introduce my book briefly, and then I sort of want to provide some background about why I wrote the book in the first place, because I think it might be of interest to some of you here on the Zoom. So my book is called Straddling Black and White. It's a historical fiction novel about Operation Moses. For those of you who don't know, Operation Moses is the operation that took place in the 1980s, which brought around 8,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel from Sudan, where they were staying in refugee camps. As you can tell, I myself am not of Ethiopian origin, but I am an immigrant to Israel. And ever since making Aliyah, and even before doing so, when I started spending time in Israel and I was considering making Aliyah, I became very passionate about the immigrant story. And, myself as a Zionist, I became especially passionate about learning about immigrants' stories of Aliyah, from people from all over the world, from Russia, from Argentina, from Ethiopia, from the United States, from Morocco, learning about what brought them to Israel. And feeling like, well, everyone had their own unique story. There was a common thread that sort of all Olim, all new immigrants to Israel share, which really is leaving behind their culture, leaving behind their country, their language, their families, and starting a new life in Israel. So that's sort of the background of, where I'm coming from, having this passion for telling the stories of immigrants to Israel. So shortly after making Aliyah, I worked for an organization called Tebeka, which is an organization that advocates for the legal rights of Ethiopian Israelis. Tebeka is a word in Amharic, which actually means justice. And there, when I was working at the organization, I met with lots of different Ethiopian Olim, immigrants to Israel, many of them who made Aliyah during Operation Moses, the operation I mentioned earlier that took place in the 80s. And I knew about Ethiopian Aliyah, but I didn't know all of the details. And in my work at Tebeka, I really became immersed in their stories and the sacrifices that they made in making Aliyah to Israel. And I really became inspired because, well, I, of course, made sacrifices in my Aliyah, leaving behind some of the conveniences in America. It doesn't begin to compare to the sacrifices that Ethiopian Jews made when they made Aliyah to Israel. So after working at Tebeka, I actually decided, my husband and I went to Ethiopia for our honeymoon. And while we were in Ethiopia, we spent a lot of time in the northern region in Gondar, the Gondar region, which is where most Ethiopian Jews came from. And while we were there, we went to small villages where Ethiopian Jews had come from. We went to their synagogues. And I really connected with the landscape, the culture, the food, and became even more immersed and passionate about the story of Ethiopian Jewry. And when I returned from Ethiopia, I enrolled in a writing course. And the very first chapter of the book ended up being really my first submission as part of this course. I had never been a writer. I certainly never considered myself a novelist. I enrolled in the writing course just out of curiosity to see what might come of it. And so chapter 1 was this story that I had, just the very beginnings of where I might want to go with it, but had no idea that it would ever turn into a book. And, but little did I know, it's actually 12 years later, so it took quite some time. It's finally been released into the world. And the writing process for me was not an easy one. I started this writing course right after getting married, right before getting pregnant with twins. And then once I got pregnant and once I gave birth, really the book was just the last thing on my mind. And I put it to the side for years. And then it took really the birth of my third child. And when I was about to go on maternity leave with my third child, that I said to myself, it's now or never. You're only going to have to take care of one baby. And I was used to taking care of two babies that were horrible sleepers. And I really committed to this process. Okay, you have 6 months of maternity leave, and this is your time to do it. So I was blessed with my third child. I was blessed with a very good sleeper. And so every day when she went down for a nap, I, instead of doing the dishes and instead of folding laundry, I sat down, I opened up my laptop and I wrote, and I was more disciplined in this 6-month period than really I had ever been in my entire life. So for six months, every day I wrote between 2 or 3 hours. Again, she was a good sleeper. And throughout this period, I, of course, did a ton of research. reading newspaper articles, reading books written about Ethiopian Aliyah, interviewing Ethiopian Israelis. But one of the things that I discovered in my research is that there was no other novel written in English about Ethiopian Aliyah. It's just not out there. There's some novels in Hebrew, but there are no historical fiction novels about Ethiopian Aliyah to Israel. There are of course historical books, but not novels. And I really, I struggled with whether or not I was the right person to be telling this story, again, not having gone through it myself. But as time went by, I realized that the story needs to be told. And if I think that I'm capable of telling it, then, I think it's a story that, and if I knew very little about the topic, when I myself considered myself to be fairly knowledgeable on all things Israel related, then certainly many American Jews and many Americans know very little about Ethiopian Aliyah to Israel. And so the writing process for me was really like giving birth to my fourth child. As I said, I wrote most of the book during my 6-month maternity leave, and the last chapter of my book I wrote on the last day of my maternity leave, when I knew I was going back to work the following week. And if you get to read my book, I hope you will, I do think that the last chapter is really moving and brings me to tears every time I read it, and hopefully it'll touch you in the same way. But when I was writing the last chapter, I just was crying, not only because the chapter was so moving, but because I had I had gone through this incredibly emotional process of writing a book. It's really an emotional roller coaster of days where you feel like you're on a high and the story flows from you, and days where you're on a low and you've hit a writer's block. And I really felt this sense of accomplishment that I had finally, after many, many years, I had made this idea come, I had seen it come to full fruition. So the book really deals how do I tell the story of Ethiopian Jewry and Operation Moses? So I do it through 3 main characters, focusing on one Ethiopian family that's torn apart. Oh, sorry, I see the title of the book is Straddling Black and White. So the story is about one Ethiopian family that's torn apart during Operation Moses. This is where the father, Kabede, makes Aliyah first, leaving behind his family in Ethiopia. And his 14-year-old daughter follows in his footsteps and embarks on the journey from Ethiopia to Sudan, and ends up getting stuck in Sudan for a period of time. And then both Kabede, the father, and Asmara, the daughter, leave behind their mother, Tigist, in Ethiopia, and she is left behind to care for her 4 children while pregnant with her 5th. And the story really jumps back and forth between these 3 characters. So it tells us the perspective of Kabede in Israel and his challenges integrating into Israeli society. It tells the perspective of Asmara, the 14-year-old daughter, on her journey to Sudan and all the physical hardships that she encounters on that journey. And then her time in Sudan, and then when she comes to Israel and her more successful Aliyah story. So through Kabede and through Asmara, you really see both the challenges that Kabede faces in integrating into Israeli society, and sort of the success story that Asmara is. And a lot of that is due to their age differences. Kabede is much older when he makes Aliyah, and so he has a harder time integrating than Asmara, who makes Aliyah when she's a teenager. And then the third character is Tigis, the mother, who's left behind in Ethiopia and struggles to raise her 5 children single-handedly, and a lot of sort of demons in their past. And the book really deals with a lot of issues that Kabede and Tigis never really spoke about, that include forced marriage, a marriage that really was devoid of love, and a lot of issues that are sort of very typical in Ethiopian society at that time. And so I think that the reader, when they read the story, they're really able to immerse themselves in the world, both in Israel, Sudan, and Ethiopia through these characters, and they're able to connect to to learn more about Operation Moses through these characters. So I want to read from the prologue now. The prologue actually takes place in 1991, which is the year that Operation Solomon took place. Operation Solomon was the second major operation. We have Operation Moses in 1983, 84, and then Operation Solomon in 1991 that brought 14,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel. And this is from the perspective of Tigist. The Tigist, again, is the mother who was left behind in Ethiopia. In the land of Ethiopia, children were raised to obey their parents and follow in their footsteps. Obedient boys grew up to be like their fathers, and docile girls grew up to be like their mothers. That was the way of the land from time eternal. Tigis had learned the laws of the land when she was a young girl, and while she often resisted them and even loathed them, with the passing of time, she had resigned herself to accept them as her fate. There really was no other choice. But Tigis' fate and that of her families was forever to be changed on two different days, decades apart from one another, but equally momentous and life-changing, when she left home. On the first of those 2 days, Tigis was an innocent 13-year-old girl who unknowingly walked out of her home towards a new life forced upon her. And now, on the second of those 2 days, Tigis turned her head and looked at the place she had called home for the past 2 decades, and then towed her frail body and her 5 children behind her. She felt her eyes well with tears, but quickly wiped them away lest her children see. There was much to be excited about, of course. A new life awaited her in the bustling capital city of Addis Ababa, where she would await immigration to Israel or making Aliyah. The prospects of living in the Holy Land and reuniting with her eldest daughter seemed more real than ever now. But despite her best efforts, Tigis' hands wouldn't stop trembling. She was, after all, leaving behind all that she had ever known. Village life may have meant suffering from the incessant village gossip she so despised and toiling from dusk to dawn to feed and clothe her hungry children. But at least it was a life with which she was familiar. And she had spent enough time in the nearby city, Gondar, over the years to know that city life simply didn't suit her. The filth, the rampant diseases, and the maimed beggars on the streets made her feel deeply uncomfortable and left her longing to return to the simple yet tranquil village life to which she was accustomed. And while living in the land of milk and honey had always been her dream, she was afraid that she was too old to start a new chapter, too old to learn the language and the culture, too terrified of the unknown, and too scared of failing. Though not yet 40, Tigis was already feeling the signs of aging, her posture slightly hunched and her looks no longer the envy of all the other women in the village. Life had been hard on her, and she was beginning to feel that years of longing for what could have been, on top of years of backbreaking labor, were finally taking its toll. She wasn't sure she was up to it. Both the journey and the destination terrified her, even though she had been singularly focused on leaving for years now, especially ever since she had made the impossible decision to send her firstborn to Israel without her. But her devoted children's words of encouragement and elation that their day had finally come gave her the strength she needed to walk out of her home for the very last time. How ironic, Tigis thought to herself. After all these years, her bony, callous feet were now following in her eldest daughter's footsteps, and not the other way around. The laws of the land were slowly but surely becoming obsolete. So that's the prologue. And I think that, what my book really gets at is the themes of Zionism, and ultimately, I think Ethiopian Jews, their love for Israel is so evident in their tremendous sacrifices that they made in coming to Israel, and their dreaming of returning to Jerusalem for thousands of years. But also my book deals with xenophobia, some racism that Ethiopian Israelis encountered when they arrived to Israel, unfortunately. The theme of forgiveness. Tigis and Kebede had a lot to work through in their marriage, and they sort of slowly in their distance from one another, and through their letter writing, they're able to slowly reconnect with one another and forgive each other for the way they hurt each other throughout their marriage. And then I think what the title of the novel really is getting at, I think, initially you might think it's talking about straddling black and white, that we're talking about two, black and white color skin, but it's really much deeper than that. Asma, as a 14-year-old, makes Aliyah to Israel. And at the time, I think a lot of us might remember when we were 14-year-olds, the world was very black and white, the way we saw the world. There was no nuance. Something was good or bad. The world just, for a 14-year-old, it's difficult for them to see how complex it can be. And as Asma comes to Israel and sort of comes to terms with some of the secrets that her parents hid from her throughout her childhood, she understands that the world is not black and white. It's much more complex than she ever realized. That's my novel. I would love for you to visit my website, www.kimsalzman.com, and I'm happy to reach out to any book clubs that might be interested in reading it. And I just wanted to thank Julie again for this wonderful opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Kim. I cannot believe you wrote it during maternity leave. That just blows me away. Very impressive.
She was a good sleeper, like I said.
Okay, I'm gonna add all of the authors to the spotlight, and we have some questions already in the chat. I'll just answer Ellen's question because she asks every time. Kim, I think all 3 books are available in paperback. And in terms of discussion guides, I think Meryl, you have one. Kim, you guys have discussion guides in your books or on your website somewhere?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so the first question in the chat, which is sent to me, let me scroll up. From Avi Landis, thank you, Avi. Question for Seth. At what point did you figure out the book structure and form, and when did you know it would actually work?
Well, that's I'm still not sure if it's working. I guess I wrote the first piece in the book, and I was really kind of dealing with themes related to this short. It was a kind of response to a short story by Franz Kafka called The Burrow, which I highly recommend. It's an amazing story. I guess it was at the end of that piece where I was like, I had the kind of concept for the book, but in terms of the structure, like as it sort of developed organically and kind of pushed forward, like from lecture to lecture. But I would say by the time I was maybe 6-7 lectures in, I had to like then complete kind of vision for it. But really, even then, still, it was much more organic from lecture to lecture. And that's generally the way I work. I have an impulse, I have a set of questions I'm interested in exploring, and I have a narrative. Like for me, the key element is just the narrative thrust and impulse and energy. I'm not really like a writer that is I'm interested in reading narratives, like I love them, but from like in terms of my work, I'm more interested in sort of exploring questions than I am in developing like a kind of linear narrative. So it's kind of the pursuit of some sort of potential answers, which are usually very incomplete, but that's kind of what drives the thing forward, not like a kind of outline of a narrative arc. If that helps at all.
That's very interesting. I guess I'm gonna pose that to Kim and Meryl as well. Like, did you have an outline for your books, or did you go with the narrative thrust and impulse as Seth did? Yeah, Meryl, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to give it to Kim, but so basically, I don't outline. But I certainly, because I was picking up where the takeaway men left off. I knew very much what I wanted to cover in Shadows We Carry. I wanted to set it, as I mentioned, in those tumultuous times and carry the story forward. But authors tell you this, and when I used to hear it, I didn't believe it, but the characters actually end up leading you, and they really tell you where you should go. So some of the things you cannot anticipate happening, and they just happen as you're writing the book.
Yeah, I agree. I had a bare bones outline. I knew that ultimately the family would reunite in Israel. But the characters really, the story unfolded itself. It just, as I continued writing, it just came to me, and it happened very organically. And because I was jumping back and forth between characters, I did want to have some sort of, okay, what's going to happen next to Tigis? What's going to happen next to Kaveri? But for the most part, it was a very, very very minimal outline, and it flowed from within.
That's great. Okay, so my next question's for Kim. Like, what now are you thinking of your next project? Have you started? Are you going to tell a different immigrant experience?
So my book was just published 2 months ago. I'm still really focusing on trying to get the word out about Straddling Black and White. It's also just a very busy year for me, where I'm juggling. I'm also trying to become a licensed tour guide, and on top of that, working a full-time job. And there's just no time for writing right now. But I have gotten some really nice feedback about my novel, and I think that it's been such an incredible process that I hope that one day there'll be a second one as well. But I have no idea what that next story will be.
Right. Sometimes you think, like, I was curious at this, Meryl, when you were speaking as well, like, when I finished my book, I thought I was done with those characters.
Right.
And then a friend of mine sent me a writing prompt. Said, oh, the NPR always like asks for Hanukkah stories. I'm sure you have a Hanukkah story. I'm like, what? I do not have a Hanukkah story. And I started a new story about my characters, that were already in the published book. And now it's turning into, God willing, a sequel or companion volume to my first book. But I didn't know that. Like, I finished it, I published it, and like this happened 6 months after the book came out. So, but you knew it, Meryl. I guess when you finished already that you wanted to write a sequel. Is that right?
It's right, but it's also the real secret about this is, if you really, while we're sharing secrets. So my husband, who is also a writer, he's a journalist. He's my muse. And after I wrote every chapter in the Takeaway Men, I shared it with him, and he commented, and he's a big expert on commas, so he corrected my commas, and he weighed in on this, and I showed him what became the last chapter, and he said, okay, this is the end of the book. And I said, no, it's not. I didn't mean to end the book here. And he said, trust me, this is the end of the book. And you know what? I was more than happy for it to be the end of the book. So I ended it there, but I had a lot more to say.
The next question is for Seth from Aaron. And Aaron, Mazel Tov on your recent award. Aaron was Aaron Hamburger, who spoke last month about Hotel Cuba, and he just, I'm gonna not say it right, but you just were awarded mid-career something. You can unmute and tell us what it is if you want, but his in a minute, or you can write it in the chat. Your question for Seth is, did you go to Berlin to research your book? What were your impressions, and how did it influence the book?
Thanks, Aaron. Nice to sort of see you here, and look forward to your reading when I go back to the States soon. I love Aaron's work. Yes, I lived in Berlin for many years, like maybe 15 years altogether. So, and I first went to Berlin in the 90s, and it was really like an incredible atmosphere and sort of countercultural moment. And so that was very impactful for my for this particular book. And I wanted to explore that, not as just someone who kind of lived through it a little bit and kind of, yeah, sort of experienced it, but sort of thinking about it a little bit more deeply, what it was, what it represented, how it changed, this kind of fading out of this type of very historically bizarre or unique kind of I would just call it maybe like a non-capitalist society in the middle of like one of the most capitalist countries in the world, Germany. But this kind of pocket of a sort of counterculture full of artists, people from all over the world who were kind of congregating there because it was just a very creative space, and the living conditions were suitable for people kind of on the periphery of the economy, like artist types, writers. So yeah, like that was, so I guess I kind of researched it through living through it and then and then thinking about it. So yeah, sort of hands-on research.
Seth, I have another question. You mentioned that Kirschbaum is likes to talk about his vanished world. Did Judaism play any part of that in his vanished world?
Well, there's a lot of kind of Jewish themes in the book, mainly him grappling with various types of texts that are from kind of the what we would call it like the biblical periphery or biblical commentary, sort of the midrashic style literature, or some like mystical interpretations. So yeah, there's a strong presence of these kind of like themes throughout the novel, but nothing really. I mean, there are a few moments when kind of like the German history intervenes. Like there's a part that has to do with a character who moves from Kiev to Berlin in the 1920s, because I at one point was really interested in the Yiddish literary scene that had kind of emigrated to Berlin like after the First World War. So that was related to that. And then, so yes, of course, that had a lot of research behind it. And then yeah, like this sort of parallel, because in Berlin, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, there was like a huge nostalgia for Berlin of the 1920s. And so I wanted to sort of think about these two eras together in relation to each other. And so part of this whole like scene that I'm describing in the 90s, which is kind of taking place around a kind of anarchist performance space, the space was sort of adapted from a space from the 1920s, which was eventually shut down by a kind of right-wing fascist, like Nazi sympathizers or party members in the late 1920s to kind of shut down some of the more experimental culture that was happening at that point. So again, I'm kind of like paralleling the rise, like that sort of fascistic element, and this is also something that Kafka's living through in the mid 1920s, and our contemporary sort of rise of right-wing extremism and sort of fascism. And I knew a journalist who was working on these issues, and the interesting thing about that was that during this period when there was a kind of not hysteria but concern with terrorism, like Islamic terrorism, at the same time there was like a parallel spike of right-wing, like white nationalist extremism in Germany, which went basically unnoticed and like that was on the radar of the, well, no, it wasn't undone. It was on the radar of the police, but they didn't do anything to shut it down. And there were many acts of kind of violence or intimidation also against Jewish people in Germany during that period. So I was sort of paralleling those two phenomena.
And still with us today, I suppose. Not just, right? Okay, we're almost out of time, so I'll just ask one more question of all three authors, and that is, we have a lot of writers on the call, so what is your favorite writing advice or best writing advice you can give to someone? Who wants to go first? Meryl, you're unmuted.
I'm thinking. Well, couple of things. So one thing is that when I was a sophomore in high school, my English teacher said to us, remember that your words are not immortal. And what that says to me, I didn't really understand it at the time. It means that you just keep writing, keep at it, keep improving it, editing it, having others read it, and you will get a better project. And I think that the other thing is Brenda Euland, who was a writing instructor probably 100 years ago or more, said when you write, you have to be bold and courageous. So just go for it.
I would say to as much as possible to fight against the feeling of imposter syndrome. It's definitely something that I've struggled with in the writing process, especially due to the topic of my novel. But that, you know, to believe in yourself and to believe in your writing abilities, and the more that you write, the better writer you become, and to prove yourself through your writing and believe in yourself.
Yeah, that's all great advice. I guess I would just go to something personal that really helped me at one point, which was an artist friend of mine. This really changed my whole life. An artist friend of mine who was mostly drawing. I was struggling, and this was back like 20 years ago, and said, you should just get off the screen and into the, and start like writing by hand and get in touch with like the physical dimension of writing. And so I basically, from that point on, I kind of was skeptical, but took his advice and started writing only by hand with like a pencil on paper. And it just really unexpectedly completely transformed my whole process. And to this day, I 20 years later, I still do all my first drafts by hand. And I guess like if I could pinpoint like maybe one thing, it's that I'm just working with what I have and not always trying to, like what I was doing before, which was to draw in material from the outside in this kind of distracted or way, but I'm just kind of in my own interior space and working with what I have and not trying to go beyond my own natural limits and writing what I kind of can produce in my own brain. And I think that really like somehow made everything work. And so if people are struggling, maybe trying to just kind of reduce and go back to the old fashioned mode of writing by hand might be a way of helping. So
Totally love that advice. I mean, I love all the advice you all gave. Yeah, I don't always write by hand, but sometimes, certainly if I'm like up against a wall and I need to try to rethink a scene or whatever, I'll write it out by hand. And I did just hear Jennifer Egan speak a few weeks ago in Jerusalem. She said she always writes by hand, and then even when she transcribes everything she's written, she resists the urge to edit as she's transcribing. She just transcribes it straight, and then takes time and goes and reads everything afterwards, and then starts, her revision process. And what you were saying, Meryl, about your teacher, my sophomore English teacher also forced us to revise, we'd hand in a paper, and he wouldn't give us a grade. It would just be full of red pen. and we'd have to hand in a revision. And then the second time, again, no grade, revise. Like we had to probably revise each paper 3 or 4 times. And we all hated him at the beginning of the year. And by the end of the year, he was my favorite teacher and was usually influential on me. So yeah, definitely takes a lot of perseverance and writing. And that the advice that I got that really worked for me, in addition to the handwriting and everything else, is someone who said to me, like, I'd been writing for a couple of years by then. And she said, just keep honing your craft. You're doing all the right things. You can continue to take classes, and I still do, even like little 2-hour classes if something's of interest to me. And just keep honing your craft. So that's my parting words to everybody here. I want to thank Kim and Seth and Meryl for a great evening, evening for us here in Israel, and daytime for those of you in North America. I put in the chat, but I'll put it again in the email tomorrow, how you can register for all the next events, and I'll give you more information and links to the authors' websites. So thanks everyone. Have a great night or rest of your day, and see you soon, I hope. Bye.